I work in 3 different schools in New York. My main one is Columbia University. It's a grad school. The second one is an undergrad, Cooper Union, very elite private school, but no one pays to go there. It's funded by this Peter Cooper from the 19th century. And then in the new school, which is a very radical, more social oriented, I do urban study program there. And they're with very young undergraduates. And my experience here was with the graduating class, with Ivan's group. And I think they have a very special teacher and a very special group. I enjoyed it very much, the discussions. But it's a thesis project, and it's very different than the way New York is. When I ran the studios in New York, we set a project for the whole class, and then the people would work in teams on the project. You'd maybe have 5 teams of 5 or something like that. And here there was like, I don't know, maybe 10 or 12 students, and each one does their own project. And so, but Ivan had set them in this difficult area under the bridge, where there's a lot of traffic, but it's a very historic area. And I enjoyed that. He wanted me to talk about my experience of New York and how it had changed. There were areas that are like that area 40 years ago in New York that were like that area now, that are unbelievably changed in the meantime. And so I was talking mainly about urban transformation and how it happens through very small scale changes over a long duration. And really that's very different than the kind of discussion that I might have in New York, where the students will be, although we did do projects that involved urban transformation, there'd be teams of people working on themes and not this kind of big array of 12 different projects. But within the projects, I really enjoyed it. There were some very, very good ideas. A pretty good spectrum of contemporary ideas about the city that you would find in any school. So I thought it was really a pretty good meeting from my point of view. And I was able to, I think the thing that I brought was that I'd actually lived through an amazing set of changes, both in London as a student and then in New York as a young professional. And that these things took time, but it was cumulative over time with this many layers and different people acting. And even if you made a master plan, which in the case of New York there was no master plan, and in the case of London also there was no master plan, the authorities can catch up afterwards and kind of secure the position and in a way legalize what's happened. In both of the cases it didn't really involve activities that you have on the perimeter of Belgrade in terms of land transactions. This was more that a change of use was illegally made from, say, industrial to residential. And in New York they learned to change the zoning very flexibly and to microcode very small areas. And I think that was something that I could bring to the studio, that history. Well, politics is very important. I really can't talk about Serbia because I don't know. I've just been here a couple of days, and one of the students in the studio had identified who owned which building and what that meant in terms of politics. It was a very interesting analysis, but it didn't necessarily lead to any conclusion. Their proposal was to try and make a forum where these people, instead of blocking each other and blocking development of the area, could communicate with each other and cooperate to make a city. And cities are about living together and cooperation in the end if you're going to have a successful city. I have to say, when I was young, I thought it was all about money and investment. And you know, the 60s was a very radical time. And you know, the profits from industry and global companies had to be invested somewhere for the long duration to bring back the rent. And that I thought that was what drove urban development. But I've learned since then that it's much more complicated. Politics plays a role in it. Politicians can be in collaboration with developers in various different ways, not necessarily illegally. In America, it's very simple and transparent. You can see the developers give money to the politicians, it's listed, and you know where you're at. Of course, now they've made it so that they can have secret slush funds as well, but it doesn't really make that much difference in the end. There's lots of research on who does what and who gives what to who. But the politics is much more complicated, and in a way it has a psychological dimension that no one really thinks about or talks about, whether you're for or against a change, whether you're for or against immigrants, whether you're for or against religion, whatever. These things all roll into the culture of the city in different ways, and you have to have ways of mediating and negotiating these differences within the city. But you can never not have difference. If you have a city that's completely peaceful, it's dead. And so there's always going to be difference and discussion, I hope, and polite or less polite discussion sometimes, but discussion. And it's really important to keep the channels of communication open in a city. In New York, it's really quite amazing to me, coming from London, just how much power community groups can have through manipulating the media and being really savvy with not a lot of money on how to position themselves inside the power structure of New York. So they have no legal stature whatsoever, but they're able to pressure the politicians into resisting financial forces in a quite amazing way. And then if they fail in that, and if they're wealthy enough, they can actually sue the government for breaches of the various laws that they might not have covered properly if they have a good lawyer, and they can block development. And it's, to me, actually it's the same in London. As a student, I was a history witness for a community group that stopped a highway going through the centre of London. It wasn't just me, it was a whole lot of people were against it. And it's quite amazing how this small groups can actually work the system. And but the really strange thing is that, having lived through that, you then see what happens afterwards, and you think you've won a victory for the old city, but the city changes in ways that you have no idea that it will do. And so you end up with something completely different than what you fought for, but actually better than what would have been if they put the highway through. So I love that unpredictability of the city. It's really beautiful, yeah. I can confess that when I saw the old war ministry in the center of town with the shattered facade and the bomb damage, and then there were other buildings that were not repaired yet, that I knew that there would be some damage, but I had no idea of the scale. I mean, I was brought up in England after the war. There were many, when I was young, ruined buildings around me when I was young, and I never really thought very much about it. But coming here and seeing it, that was a reminder of the bad times and the shock. That was a shock. I was really, because I knew the history of the city over the long period, one of the things that drew me here, besides my friends that I would see, was to see New Belgrade across the river, which has a very bad reputation in the books, but because of the work I'm doing about cities and New Town, the planning after the war, and because of the old Yugoslavia, which when I was young was one of the places that was outside the Soviet orbit that was more interesting, I really wanted to see that. And I will see it tomorrow. But I've already started thinking about it in a whole different way than when I first arrived. We drove through it, and it seems like you're in China or somewhere. You know, they're building just the same stuff with the towers and the big slab blocks and the big setbacks. But then speaking to people who live in it, like they were saying that the walls are really thick, it's very quiet, the gardens are beautiful, and the trees are 50 years old.
People like it, don't they?
They like it. And also that talking to Ivan, before you come, you think it's just one thing, and then when you talk to him with the history, it's so big that it's actually got different things, pieces inside it. And so it's actually quite diverse in a way over the time. And so that's also something I've learnt, though I've not really gone in and explored. We were in a massive traffic jam yesterday, so we switched from one bridge to the other, so I got a sense of what it's like here. I could say that it's great you've pedestrianized the center, but you're still crazy about cars here. And when I was young, I was crazy about cars too, and I'm not against cars, but in cities they really aren't efficient. And like New York, they're taking out car parking spaces, they're widening the sidewalks, they're improving the buses, they're putting in all this informational systems to make the streets kind of digital, accessible places with a lot of information in them. And it's really turning into an informational city and not a transportation city. It's a place where pedestrians and cyclists and public transportation of a modern kind, not the old stinky buses and stuff, where they really make an effort to make it very easy to get around the city without a car. And I can see that you've got the beginnings of it here. It's kind of like Copenhagen in the 70s or 80s. And then there's another step. But it's kind of, I can see here that it's a little bit like Italy, where people think they can park anywhere on the sidewalk, whatever. If they have a car, you own the city. And maybe that's okay in New Belgrade, but the old city, it really needs further work, I would say, on the pedestrianization. In Montreal, they made a very beautiful waterfront in the 80s and 90s, keeping the railway track all the way around. And there's obviously lessons that you could learn. They have piers that go out, but you have the boats down there. And it's obviously a very beautiful place to be in the summer when it's hot, down by the water and everything. And there's a kind of lost opportunity down there. Though I did see some, I went to a really wonderful restaurant down there with Ivan. It was pretty good. Iguana or something, yeah. And that was pretty impressive. That was world class, I would say. And I know there's clubs and all the rest down there, which is, I'm too old, but other people enjoy. In New York, we're really thinking about food and the city and artisanal food, and there's a whole new thing of craft culture, small scale craft culture coming up from the bottom, and with people who are like my children's age starting small businesses, and they're very internet savvy, so they can sell through the internet, have a tiny little office somewhere in an abandoned building, and make a whole new culture in a piece of the city that is very, very internet savvy. And I imagine that this is something that could happen here in the future, you know. But I don't see it, I don't know enough to know whether it's happening now. With time, that will change everything, I think. Have a much bigger effect over time. Yeah, I'm not a very good aggressive critic. I love cities. I love all kinds of cities. I love cities with cars. I love Los Angeles. I love old cities, the historic core. There's many different people in the city, and they all have their own logic. I call them urban actors, and they each one pursue their own profit or pleasure or whatever they want, and at a small or a big scale. And so the city is made from all of their interaction and interweaving together. And I don't feel like anyone has to apologize that they should do this. I get angry with some people when they get too greedy and they take from too many people, because then it makes it uneven inside the city. And actually, I think inside the city it's very important that there be ways and ladders for people to change their status. University through knowledge is one way. Business through money is another way, politics is another way, maybe religion another way. All of these threads go into the mix of the culture of the city. But it's for me, it's that there's not just one dominant thread. That's like in the past. Now it's like this dynamic, shifting mixture. And that's what makes it really impossible to make a plan, master plan. Because this mixture is shifting and changing, you can never, you have to be flexible to handle that. I don't know how that's going to appeal to the planning department when I go there, but you know, New York hasn't had a master plan since 1968. They only make little plans for little areas, and they consult with everybody on these sort of micro plans, and then they change them at regular intervals with consultation. So and the developers are in there as well as the community, and it's a very political process, but it's always going on, and it takes a lot of work actually, but it's worth it for the city in the end. In America, they stopped thinking about how to administer cities after the Second World War. They just shift everybody to the suburbs, and they just abandon the city and it collapsed. Then they have the oil crisis in the 70s, and they suddenly realize, whoops, not very smart. And they start to come back into the city and to politically organize it, administratively reorganize it, planning, reorganize it, everything, reorganize it, take them 40 years. Again, It's unbelievable, the change in the city, in New York anyway, and even in London too. Yeah, but it's to have multiple voices inside the city is really important. And they don't have to sing in harmony, that's the Chinese way. If I go to Houston, Texas, if I go to Venezuela, if I go to Nigeria, if I go to Angola, if I go to Indonesia, they all have oil. They have money. And they live the American dream of the 50s, or a version of it. And you know, they will be the last people to feel the impact of the oil problem, because they will have the reserves into the future. The rest of us are going to have to change. And America especially, because they had such cheap oil. Oil was cheaper than water. It still is cheaper than... When you buy a bottle of water in America, it costs more than the petrol. I mean, it's completely mad. And it's subsidized by the government and everything. And so, you know, there's no tax, hardly any tax on the oil. And so they have no idea of the reality of the situation. But it's even so, it's sort of sinking in. In this last crisis, the thing that really triggered the crisis was the cost of oil. It went to $4 a gallon in the States, and over 120 on the barrel. And that made it that people had to choose between driving to work or eating, and then paying the mortgage. And so then the whole thing go down. And it's not going to get cheaper. So far, there's only, in China, they say 50%. In India, 1/3 of the people in the city. Once they all move to the city and want to have cars and modern conveniences, you can say goodbye to cheap oil. And it doesn't have anything to do with, you know, they could never have enough oil for that in terms of world population. And so Americans are going to have, I mean, they're waking up to that, and they're trying to plan ahead for that. And I think actually everywhere, other than the oil-rich countries, have to think about that. The European Union is doing that already, much more than the US, trying to think ahead. The Chinese, in a very strange way, they begin to think about it because they realize they'll be in competition with the states for the resources, and it's not going to be pretty if that happens, and they try to avoid it. So they're smart, you know. I think they're switching to a lot of electricity and solar and all the rest of it, and they have still the command economy where they can make it happen like that, and that will make, in a way, I have a lot of hope of. If China can do that on a mass scale, they can show how it can be done. Other places, they can export that. I mean, it'll be really interesting for the world. I hope it happens, but it could not, you know. But that would make a very big difference to cities everywhere. They still fly jets from Boston to New York when the train could do it in half the time. And they fly down to Washington, and it takes you an hour and a half to get to the airport, an hour to get through security, and 40 minutes on the plane. I mean, then you've got to get into town. I mean, it's completely mad. I can imagine that in Europe, I mean, they have the high-speed rail, London to Paris, London to Brussels, London to Amsterdam, so on. It's a completely different system. And I was brought up in northwest London, and St Pancras Station used to be this ruin. And now it's the big international terminal for the whole, I mean, for all the trains from Europe, and it will be to the north of England. And it's just beautiful. You know, I think it's fantastic. So yeah, I believe in public transportation. And then actually I think the future will be short-range cars that they begin to manufacture in Japan already, that will do 100 miles in a, you know, there and back, 50 miles each way. The average journey that an American makes in a day is 8 miles. They just drive 4 miles to the mall and then back again. And they have this huge machine to do this. I think that the future will be short-range cars to hubs with high speed. And I think in Europe they'll get it before America. It's happening. I know Thom Mayne and I admire him very much as an architect. And I think his building at Cooper Union, where I work, is really beautiful. The staircase and the interior organization. And he was a graduate student at the AA when I was a young teacher. I didn't teach him in London, yeah, but I met him there in the early 70s. And then I would see him in LA when I would go there. And then I saw him again when he was working on Cooper. So it goes on. And my first book was called Recombinant Urbanism, and his first book is Recombinant something else, I can't remember. So, but he invited me, when I did my book, over to UCLA to lecture, and I didn't know why, and then his book came out and I realized why. We both share this idea of a recombinant city, that the city has elements in it that are recombined, like in the DNA. Over time they switch and change as different urban actors take power or shift. And that I think that the important thing for a city like Belgrade is to recognize the important pieces that they want to keep as memory pieces, and then also to try and recognize the characteristics of the city that make the city for them, for you. And like speaking with Ivan, he talks about how modernity was very fragmented here, that there was never a long period of modernity in the 19th century, say, or in the early 20th century, or in the mid-20th century, that everything was cut off. And maybe that kind of cut off, that's one of your characteristics, is to be like that. And to have a total plan never really works. And so I would think that to try and, I mean, you can't plan to be cut off in your plans, but in a way you can. And so to have that in the back of your mind when you make a plan, that it might not be, but what might be, might actually contribute to the city as a piece into the mix, would be a really interesting way and very different way to think about a city. Also, in my idea of a city is that it is dynamic and changing, and always in chaos and always in disequilibrium, not balanced. If it's balanced, it's dead, and I wouldn't want that. So, I mean, to say it's chaotic is good, actually. I mean, not too much, obviously, because then no one knows what to do or to be happy. I get so much pleasure from cities, it's just crazy. And I think it's fantastic to make the pedestrian area. I think that in the long term, people, because of the oil money side of it, people will regroup. They may not regroup, the center city will come back in one way, but it's not going to be just the center city, it'll be multiple poles. Maybe some of the shopping malls will develop towers and become new centers in the periphery. I don't know. I imagine that for America. And then There'll be some sort of public transportation that hooks up to these new nodes. And it's already starting to happen in LA. The new malls in LA that were built on where they had the fruit and vegetable market, kept the old market, which was run by Mexicans at that point, and then built this billion-dollar mall next to it that includes offices and apartments, and as well as the mall and this gigantic parking, and has a little streetcar running inside it, which is just rubbish really, but you know, it's the old streetcar system of LA as a kind of image marketing thing. And that if that streetcar actually went to downtown, you'd have a whole other story, you know. The city beginning to connect itself up. They're actually building subways there in LA. So in the 19th century, when we were running on coal and steel and steam, the city had one format. In the 20th century with the car, late 20th century, we've got another format, and I expect another format. You know, it won't be uniform everywhere, but somehow there'll be some new rebalancing coming out in the future. And that's pretty exciting for me. That's where the work is, to try and guess that. And if I was a more practical person, I'd be making investments in old malls, you know. Yeah. European and American cities are basically shrinking. What's happening is we have relatively stable populations, but because of our wealth, we can build bigger spaces for ourselves. So we grow, but it's the same number of people. And like New York, they're terribly excited in New York because they think in 20 years they'll get 1 million people. Excuse me, in China, you can get 1 million people in 5 years. It's like, you're terribly excited, you're getting 1 million people in 20 years, it's nothing. And London are the same, they think they get 1 million people in 20 years. And it's all immigration, it's not from the people who are in the city. And cities always have had immigration, and that's part of their dynamic and the flow. But it's really very slow in Europe compared. I mean, the EU has the barriers around it, you can't get in. England has even more. I mean, it's, each country makes its own rules. The US has very tough ones now. And actually, the US is pretty interesting. People are leaving. The Mexicans who came to the US, they're leaving because of the depressed economy and going back to Mexico because it works better there. I mean, this is like, get your head around that one is a huge. Latin America is doing better. Brazil and these other countries are doing better than the US right now in terms of growth. Brazil has like 10-12% growth like China. And so it's kind of interesting, the shift in power and attractiveness of the different places and how that affects the balance and the sense of balance inside the city. And when I went from London, where I was born, to, well, first of all Boston and then New York, I thought it was so fast and dynamic and amazing because they had all the highways and big cars and the whole works, suburbanization, malls, the works. Now when I come back from Hong Kong or Shanghai or Bangkok or somewhere to New York, I feel like I'm going to Venice. I mean, it's so slow and it's so stable, and it's ridiculous, and I think it's more dynamic here probably. There's parts of New York where things are happening, but it's just little patches, and the rest of it is like just running on this kind of autopilot, quite Good autopilot, but, you know, autopilot.